Hi, this is Terrence Revo from the Senior Lawyers Division. I'm taking the oral history of Janice Pastor this afternoon. Janice, welcome and thank you very much for your willingness to sit and share your life experiences in the law with us. So I'd like to start by saying, since you are retired, is that correct?
I'm retired, and I actually stopped practicing in 2006. I went on to be a trustee, one of several trustees for my father's estate after I stopped practicing.
And from the time that you left law school until now, can you give us an overview of your legal career?
Wow. Well, I was a late comer to law school. I started law school when I was 39 in 1981. So I had two young children at the time. And I finished in 1984. After interviewing around, I opened a solo practice. I remained in solo practice until 2006.
And what was the nature of your practice, the type of clients that came in and sought your services?
Well, I didn't do personal injury, except an occasional case. I didn't represent insurance companies or banks. I represented real people with tough problems. Those were the kind of people who came through my door.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you had a varied practice in different areas of the law, depending on who showed up at your doorway.
Well, there were obviously some areas I didn't do, like bankruptcy, for example. But yes, every year was different, and depending on clients who came asking for help, I'd represent them to the best of my ability. I did do quite a bit of construction law and settling houses, but and had clients who were contractors and subcontractors, small ones. But besides that, it was often just a question of what showed up.
Mm-hmm. All right. And you said you retired in 2006. What led you to the belief that it was time to hang up your shingle?
Well, my father passed away, and there were three of us who were co-trustees. He owned real estate, a lot of real estate you probably wouldn't want to own. And I started studying the financials of his business. And there was quite a dispute that arose between myself and my brother and brother-in-law. And it was taking so much out of me. I just decided at that point that I really needed to stop representing clients and start taking care of myself. It was a pretty dark period in my life.
Now, in addition to the practice of law, you also entered politics at some point in time.
I did. 4 years after I started practicing law in 1984. In 1988, I was elected to the state senate, and I served 2 terms.
So what caused you to want to be part of the political mechanisms of this state?
Well, that, Terry, is really the story of my life in New Mexico. And practicing law was in some respects incidental. When Stuart and I moved to New Mexico, my husband was on the faculty at the medical school and at the old BCMC. He was in the radiology department. That's what brought us here. And I had 2 young children, and I got interested in childcare and in the consequences for young families that had no good means of support, and what was happening to those families when a woman who was on welfare tried to go to work, what was happening to those children. That was the issue that drew me into the political scene in New Mexico.
Wow. So you served 2 terms as a state senator, correct?
Well, this was 1975.
Oh, okay, then
So
this is
it
before.
was way back before I went to law school. And from the child care issue, I went on to reproductive freedom and abortion rights. I worked on those issues extensively for the New Mexico Women's Political Caucus. Really, what drew me into all of it was my feeling that women were not full participants in our society and in the decisions that were made that affected us, that had an impact on us. I was involved in the early women's movement. It's hard to think back that far, but that would have been Gloria Steinem and some others. And I wanted to be able to be the person who shaped the policy.
So is that why you decided to go to law school?
It was one of the major reasons I decided to go to law school. And I knew that my dad wasn't going to live forever, although he lived more than 20 years after I started law school. But I wanted to have the tools to protect myself and my family from what I thought might be a difficult situation.
So you started law school, and what did you think of, where did you go to law school?
Oh, well, I had 2 young children, and I stayed right here. I went to the University of New Mexico.
What did you think of the education you got at the UNM Law School?
You know, looking back, it was an excellent education, but it was a kind of a strange situation because most of the faculty at that time were my age. They were people that I knew socially, a number of them. And sometimes it created some problems for me. And sometimes maybe I was overcritical of some of those men professors, because that's what they were, with the exception of Ruth Covenant, because they were my age, and I didn't always agree with them.
Mm-hmm. So you finished in 3 years.
Yes.
So you get your law degree, you take the bar exam, you passed. What was your thinking? What am I going to do now?
Well, I had clerked at a large law firm, at least large for New Mexico, at Sutton, and I really didn't care for the environment of a large law firm, and I wasn't interested in being an associate that did a lot of research and didn't get directly in contact with clients. I interviewed around a couple of places, and I eventually just decided to go out on my own, which was a crazy idea. But anyway, that's what I did.
Were there many women attorneys going out on their own at that point in time?
Well, actually, there were women attorneys going out on their own, and partly because the large law firms weren't hiring many women at that point in time. And half my class was female. So there were more and more of us graduating from the law school, but the so-called prestige jobs were not usually going to women.
And you say half of your class were women. How did that, to the extent that you know, how did that change the environment at the law school, having so many women as law students?
Well, that's interesting. I guess I hadn't thought about that. Nor have I thought about whether the male faculty tended to lean to the male students and not to the female students. I don't remember that being a problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. So you were on your own, you're practicing. Who were you practicing with at the time?
I rented an office from Raymond Sanchez and Reggie Garcia. They owned a building at 8th and Gold. Reggie has passed away, and I think Raymond's still in there. I'm not sure. I'm sure he's still there.
And Were there other lawyers in the office at the time?
Well, actually, Raymond's younger brother, Michael, who many people will remember as the majority leader in the Senate, and a lot of people got angry at Michael. He was a pretty tough guy. His office was right next to mine, and he became a kind of a mentor for me. He helped me out, and not so much with how to do a case, but just with generally how to conduct myself as a lawyer.
Was the environment with Raymond and Michael in the office, was that part of the reason you decided to go into politics?
Well, before I got elected, I had managed several campaigns for Raymond. He represented my district. And he suggested that I might open up an office there. And I initially thought, well, we'll see how this goes, but I don't know anything. And I can always move on to another job if I want to. But really, I wanted to be in control of my own time and my own calendar and my own clients. And so for me, that worked out pretty well.
The 6 years was it 6 years you spent in the Senate?
Eight.
8.
2 terms.
All right. I'm assuming that had a major impact on your life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me, that was the realization of being able to have an impact on issues that I really cared about. And that's what drove me to run for public office. I just thought that a woman's voice was not being heard. And in fact, when I first got elected, I remember saying to my husband, oh my God, they let me vote. Because there were so few of us in the Senate at that time.
Who were the women who were in the Senate with you?
Well, Mary Jane Garcia from Las Cruces, who became my fast lifetime friend. In fact, I just talked to her before Thanksgiving. Her sister passed away. Her last sister passed away, the one that she lived with. And so we stay in pretty close communication. Then Christine Donisthorpe, well, I'm a Democrat. Christine Donisthorpe, who was a Republican from Farmington. And then a woman from Gallup. Golly, her name will pop up. A woman from Gallup. There were 4 of us. But really, given the issues with 2 of them, Mary Jane became my fast friend.
So what were the issues that were important to you during the time that you were in the Senate?
Well, of course, I worked on things that were known as women's issues in those days. I passed some bills related to domestic relations and domestic violence. But my real interest was healthcare and what we called in those days healthcare reform. New Mexico was way behind the times in terms of its statutes and its practices in the Department of Insurance. And there was a task force. I can't remember if I served 3 or 4 years on it. I chaired it twice. And it was a real beginning for New Mexico of trying to make sure that more people had health care available to them. That was really our goal. And trying to modernize our statutes and the practices at the Department of Insurance.
Was the fact that your husband was a doctor, did that influence your desire to work in the healthcare area?
No. Actually, no. I was more, my husband didn't, when I talked to him about problems in our insurance code, his eyes would just glaze over. He wasn't at all interested in healthcare availability. He worked a long day, and he was interested in giving his patients the best medical care that he could. And he doesn't have a political bone in his body. So the work that I was doing wasn't much influenced by him at all.
Who were your mentors in this work that you were doing for healthcare and women's issues?
Wow. Well, I'm going to tell you, if you put me on a desert island and I figured out how to make a raft, I would jump on the raft and sail out to sea. And that pretty much describes my life. When I first started lobbying, there was a woman in the Women's Political Caucus named Donna Smith. And Donna went on to work in finance at the University of New Mexico, and she was the Association of Counties manager before that. But at the time, she was a dental hygienist, and she was lobbying to try to improve the lot of hygienists in the state. She's the person who took me into the Capitol and showed me around. There weren't too many women in those days lobbying or serving. I mean, it wasn't a place where a nice girl was supposed to be. And as far as law goes, I relied on my education, and I relied on people that I knew, but nobody in particular, except maybe Michael, who he just kind of pointed me in the right direction.
What was it like being one of the very few women up at the Roundhouse at that time? What was what was your reception by the guys up there?
Wow. Well, I never tried to make an issue of the fact that I was a woman when I was there. In fact, I served as the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee the second 4 years in office, and that's a big job by itself without the health care issues. I tried to befriend male state senators who sat near me, and I became good friends with some of them. But there was plenty of discomfort at my presence. I heard the boys talk about things that probably they weren't too happy that I heard. I had experiences like walking into a committee hearing and before it started, having a male senator tell me to leave so he could tell a dirty joke. But, you know, if you're going to be equal, you have to act like you have to act equal. You can't just sit back and let them push you around.
Now, you were a lobbyist before you actually became a senator, is that correct?
I was an unpaid lobbyist working on issues that I had a passion for. So, until the time I started law school, I wasn't making big bucks. And in fact, it amazes me today to look at the conversation in Washington about accomplishing all the things that we wanted to accomplish back in the 70s for families and for childcare. I mean, we're finally talking about the issue all these years later. How many years is that? 40? It's about
That sounds
40
like a
years.
plus and a minus, that it took so long for the issues to rise to the top of awareness. But yet they're there now when it was very difficult before.
Well, you know, I always, when people ask me, I say every dog has its day. And that's true of political issues. I'm on the board of the Southwest Women's Law Center right now. I've been on that board quite a while. And we're working on paid family and medical leave. The board's role is fairly limited, although initially I played a bigger role when the executive director moved on and we were between directors. What was your question, Terry?
I don't know, I got lost in your answer.
So did I.
Well, you know, my question was, you were involved in these women's issues.
Yes.
That are now maybe 40 years later coming to top of mind in Washington and in other political areas of the country. And that's got to be a plus and a minus. it's a plus that they're top of mind now, but it's a frustration that it took so long to
Yes,
get there.
sure.
That
And
was my
look,
question.
You know, and look at what's happened to a woman's right to control her own body. It stuns me that legislators would try to dictate medical practice, and that comes from living around physicians for the last 55 years. I mean, you have to let a patient and a physician make medical decisions, and regulating them is a perilous course. But look what the Supreme Court did. And now women's reproductive freedom is back where it was at the time that I was lobbying to defeat highly restrictive legislation in New Mexico. It's terrifying. So I guess in terms of children and childcare, and recognizing that women, if you want them to work and make a living and support their families, that those children need good care that's affordable for families.
In terms of your time up at the Senate in the Roundhouse, was there any specific issues or any specific difficulties that you can call to mind that were important? Let me rephrase that question because it's a lousy question. When you were up in the Senate, aside from the general concept of women's issues and healthcare issues and children's issues, were there important political debates that you were a part of that stick in your mind at this point in time, beyond the issues that you went to the Senate for?
Boy, Terry, I didn't think about what were the big issues, what were the issues of the day. I sure remember sitting on the floor and listening to long debates about issues. Some of them were issues I cared about, and some were not. I did become so deeply involved in healthcare, and we would adopt packages of 12, 15 bills, and we had a good staff. I can't remember where we got the funding, but we had a better staff than most senators are able to have for working on issues, and we followed those issues all the way through. I guess I don't have a ready answer for you on that one.
You've also been involved in a lot of community organization committees. Can you talk about some of those?
Well, before and after I practiced law, I've been involved in the community. When we first moved here, the Jewish community had, what did they call it? It was before we had a Jewish Federation. I served on that board, and we had a hired staff person, and it didn't end well from my recollection. And when I left the legislature, then I served on a series of different boards because it was a way for me to keep myself involved and keep my hand in issues that I cared about.
Mm-hmm. What were some of those boards?
So I think the first one was New Mexico Voices for Children. I served on that board when the first executive director, Kay Monaco, was running the organization, and then served under several other directors. I was on that board for a long time, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years. I served on the foundation board at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and during some difficult years, I've been on the Southwest Women's Law Center board for probably 10 years now. I'm trying to think. I'm sure there were some others that I'm not thinking of. And I'm also now serving on the regional board for the Anti-Defamation League.
That's particularly important in today's world with the rise of the anti-Semitic activities that are filling up the news these days.
Boy, I mean, board members are not central to the activities of the organization. We're more advisory. But this region has an excellent executive director, a man named Scott Levin, who's really a very smart guy. And he's a retired lawyer, by the way, who had quite a career in Denver. And it's so timely. I feel like it's important to be there for all of us, not just for the Jewish community, but for other groups that are suffering from incredible discrimination in this very difficult climate that we're in right now.
Yeah. Are you currently involved in any other community activities other than the ones that you mentioned?
That's already too much, since my husband has some health problems, and really he takes most of my time right now.
Wonderful. And not wonderful that he has the health problems, but it's wonderful that you're caring for him in a way that makes a difference in both of your lives.
I hope so.
You've talked an awful lot about your legal career. Let's talk a little bit about your early life. Where did you grow up, and where did you go to school?
Well, I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. I lived in St. Louis County in a community called Ladue and attended public schools there. I went on from there to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. My mother actually had a big family in Chicago. That's where she was born and raised. I got a degree in actually English and creative writing. I went on to graduate school. I was going to get a PhD at a very lovely small school called Tufts University in Somerville, Massachusetts. I was a PhD dropout. I took my master's degree and left. I met my husband about then, and he was, at the time, he was an intern in St. Louis. That's how I met him, blind date. And he finished his 1 year there, and then we went to the Bronx for 3 years, and he did a residency at Montefiore Hospital, which is one of the Einstein hospitals. Very interesting place because they had taken physicians from Europe who suffered the Holocaust and whose families were involved in the Holocaust, and brought them to Montefiore and got them their licenses. Very interesting people. Of course, the chairman of the department was an American, but quite interesting to meet these people and hear about their experiences. It was the Vietnam War, and a terrifying time. It's hard to describe to my children or to anybody what it was like who wasn't born and didn't go through that experience. Fortunately, Stuart was in the Air Force, and he had something called the Berry Plan, and that meant he got deferred until he was fully trained. And as a fully trained radiologist, he went to one of the specialty hospitals that had fully trained physicians. So our peers, the other physicians who were serving their 2 years along with us, were specialized. They were specialized in various fields. And we lived on the base for 2 years. Our son was born during his stay in New York, and our daughter was born at an Air Force hospital. Then those Vietnam years were difficult because friends of ours did have to go to Vietnam, and none was killed, but bad things happened to them. They had miserable experiences. After the Air Force, he did a fellowship at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, now known as Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And from there, we came to New Mexico.
And you came to New Mexico as a result of his position with the university?
Yes, he did specialized training in vascular radiology. It's right now, nobody is doing what he learned anymore because of MRI and CT. But at that point in time, it was all done by injection and by insertion of dyes. And it was very, very stressful, by the way. It was a stressful year for him. So he came to the university, especially for pediatric cardiology and adult cardiology, mostly pediatric.
So what year were you married?
What year were we married? 1967. And we came to New Mexico in 1973.
We talked about your law school experiences. Were there any professors at the law school that you particularly admired?
Wow. Well, of course, I admire Ruth Kaufman, and again, she's my age peer. She may be a few years older than me. And everybody admired and loved Dean Desiderio. He was a wonderful teacher, and he was a very fair-minded man. He is a very fair-minded man.
You talked about your husband, and you've told us about your children. What are their names?
Oh, my son, his name is Bennett, and my daughter's name is Elisa.
All right. And do you have any grandchildren?
I have one grandson. My son waited a long time, and until he was 39. So Elliot is only 13 at this point, going on 14. And my daughter has never had children, unfortunately. She's a lawyer.
And a good one, I hear.
Well, she does land use and development in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And at this point, she started her own law firm with 2 other land use attorneys. And she's still active in the planning community. So she has had quite a career.
Was there anything about your earlier legal work in construction that impacted Alicia in terms of what she chose to specialize in?
I don't know. Maybe. She got interested in planning. When she was at Bryn Mawr, she was able to build her own major, and she built a major around planning communities, and then went on and got a master's degree in London in that field. And when she was working for the planning department here in Albuquerque, she came to me one day and she said, "Mom, I'm not making very much money, and I can do a better job than these lawyers who come in and make presentations to me." So the rest is history for her.
In terms of the time that you spent in the legal community, as well as in the political community, do you see a difference in the New Mexico culture from then until now?
Oh, wow. The whole world has changed, Terry. I feel like Rip Van Winkle when you ask that question.
I don't think you're that old.
Well, I just had a big birthday because you were at my party.
That's true.
I think the whole world has changed, really. And when I look at the reports about what's happening in the Senate, I actually am pretty miserable. I don't like what I'm hearing, because personal relationships and personal differences now appear in the debate on the floor of the Senate. And in my opinion, that should never be happening, and that's a real disservice to the people who elect those of us who serve.
Are you talking about the New Mexico Senate, or are you talking about the U.S. Congress?
No, I'm talking about New Mexico. I don't have any direct personal experience with the U.S. Senate.
I've heard people say that you really don't want to see how legislation is produced. It's kind of like making sausage. Given your experience, would you agree with that?
Well, it's not true. There's some things that just pass right through, right? And it's just a question of getting the text of the bill right. And if you're amending the statutes, being very careful that you are producing something that's going to be workable. But there are issues that come along that are like that, where a lot of work happens behind the scene.
And it also appears as though you practiced law and you were in politics at a point in time when women became a much more important part of both of those processes. Is that correct?
Not really. The real changes have happened since I left. Right now, the House of Representatives, I think there's more women than men. It's hard for me to imagine that. And there were women serving, especially when I was in my second term. There were more women serving in the House and the Senate. But I think the whole landscape has changed completely with the election of large numbers of women. The Senate doesn't have a majority of women, but if you look at the House, it's hard for me to even imagine. It's a whole different picture of how you get things done to be dealing with other women.
Can you expand on that?
Well, my road to success on any particular issue was always to prepare the best draft of the bill I could, and the drafters got pretty tired of me because I wanted it to be perfect going out the gate. And then to just stay on top of the committee referrals and make sure that my bills got heard. But I had to deal with all those male chairmen of those committees and male leadership on the floor. So I had to try to be tactful, which is not so easy for me sometimes, and really stay on top of things. I don't know how it is now, but if I served in a body that had a majority of women or many women, I would be working in a whole different milieu, in a whole different environment than the environment that I experienced.
I guess that raises the question about what kind of differences women are making in today's legal and political world that you've been able to observe.
Boy, that'd be a great PhD thesis for somebody to take a look at what kinds of bills get sponsored and what categories they're in. But it's my sense that a lot of issues that women have cared about for a long time they now show up as legislation. And it's not just things directly affecting women. I think it's affecting kids who have learning problems and medical problems. It's domestic violence, of course. There's some family law issues that I think have become refined. It's violence issues and gun issues. But I'm just a casual observer from the outside.
If there was a young woman who was thinking about going into law and was thinking about starting law school at this point in time, would you have any advice or suggestions to them as to how to be in the law school and how to be in the practice of law and how to be in the political arena?
Wow.
That's a big question.
It sure is, because it's not, I don't think that the legislature has changed just because the makeup is more female. I think we have a whole new generation that are very different from those of us who are in senior status now. The federal government calls us elderly. I got pretty offended, but I guess I am. I think it's a different world for them. And I think they relate to each other in different ways than we did. I think COVID has changed a lot of things for young attorneys and the way they practice law. I'm sure it has. So it's hard to think about giving that kind of advice. I think the hardest thing about practicing law is carving out enough time to take care of yourself and to take care of your family. Because at least I was always feeling like a client deserved my best. And if I thought a client needed something and I needed to do that for them, that always came first for me.
That's a popular issue in today's legal world, of the work-home life balance. Excuse me. And there's a lot of discussion and a lot of committees dealing with wellness issues. Are you familiar with the... Let me get some water. Are you familiar with any of the current aspects of work-home life balance?
Just superficially, because I'll see, I don't really open those emails from the State Bar very often, but even if you just read the heading, you can see that there's a lot more happening now than there was back in the 1980s, 1990s on that subject. And I was just at a social event where I ran into a woman who's a mediator. She used to be a judge. She's still doing it. She was in law school a year ahead of me. And it seems mediation was new when I was practicing. And by the time I stopped practicing, there was more and more of it. But it seems much more common now. And the use by attorneys may be more common now. It was pretty difficult with some attorneys to get them to consider mediation when I was practicing.
Well, it's not much of a choice these days. If you're in litigation, the judge is going to
to order
it, and you have to go, whether you think it's appropriate or not for your case.
Well, I think that's good, and it did happen to me a few times, but mostly not. And sometimes attorneys would just run you around before they would get down to business and get something completed.
There seems to be a real difference in the way that attorneys achieved settlements back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, even into the 90s, than the way people are almost relying upon mediations as opposed to sitting down and talking to one another, attorney to attorney.
I hope so. But, even then, what you needed was a deadline, like a trial date or a hearing date on a major motion, and then you got movement. But as long as there were no deadlines, it was just fight.
I guess that's the way we attorneys are.
That's too bad.
You touched on some things before that I want to go back and revisit. You mentioned that you were on the board, I think, of the foundation for the Hispanic Cultural Center.
I was.
What did you do while you were on the board? What were the issues that you thought were important?
Well, a foundation is primarily a fundraising entity. And the woman who was the director of the foundation in those days, and I'd rather not say her name, it did not end well for her. But she did a good job of attracting high-profile people, many of them Hispanic, that could help her fund. The foundation is there to help fund the programs at the center. And that's where our attention was directed. Eventually, I became the chair of the board, and I turned it down many times before I finally consented to take it. And the bottom line was that the foundation was floundering, that the books were being cooked, and they wanted an Anglo woman to take the heat for what had to happen there.
And so did you take the heat?
I did take the heat. I did it. Yes, I did. I investigated as carefully as I could. I documented everything that I could, and I don't think there was any, well, there was wrongdoing that might have merited criminal action, but I don't think there was anything intentional there. I don't think anybody was skimming. And in fact, I think the opposite was happening. I think the director was putting money in at some points to try to keep it afloat.
And as we were talking before, you were talking about, I think it was Catherine Liebeck, and she had a perception about not-for-profit organizations.
Oh, Kathleen Liebeck.
Kathleen.
Yes.
Kathleen.
Well, Kathleen is a retired attorney who I'm sure some people, if they listen to this during our lifetimes, they'll remember her. And she was the president, I think, of the United Way Board. And she said, sooner or later, all nonprofits have financial problems and they go under financially.
Do you agree with that?
Well, in my experience in the organizations where I served on the boards, it certainly was true.
Why do you think that Why do you think that happens?
Well, these boards, whether it's a foundation or a community board like the Jewish Federation or New Mexico Voices or Southwest Women's Law for that matter, in those days relied primarily on the generosity of people in the community. I think what I've observed at Southwest Women's Law Center is there are many more foundation grants available today, and that's a real sustaining source of money for Southwest Women's Law Center. Going out in the community, and getting somebody to give $50 can be a lot of work. And it takes a very gifted person to raise the money that's needed to sustain an organization.
Well, it sounds like you were one of those gifted people, given the number of organizations.
Well, I don't know about that. I'm not a great fundraiser. I'm more of an oversight person. That's the role that I play.
I always ask this question, and some people have an answer and others don't. What advice, if any, could you give to a young woman fresh out of law school in today's legal world, which the world that you are aware of? What advice could you give them?
Well, I'll tell you the advice that I gave my daughter.
All right.
She went to Kansas City when she went to the University of New Mexico law school, and she went to Kansas City to work for a very famous land use lawyer. And eventually he decided to go to Los Angeles, and they worked for a very prestigious international firm called Paul Hastings. And I walked in there and looked around, and it made my skin crawl, but because it wouldn't have been for me. And I said to her, Elisa, do this as long as you like it. And when you don't like it, leave. Move on to a different kind of a setting, or stop practicing law altogether. I think, we each only have one life to live. And if you don't really believe in what you're doing, or you don't like your life every day, day to day, then move on and do something else.
I think that's wonderful advice for all the lawyers out there. If you don't like what you're doing, it's time to do something else.
Right. And I always am taken aback when I hear somebody say the law is my life. And I'm sure that's true for some people. And I know there are lawyers who practice 50, 55 years and they love every minute. But I wonder if they ever thought about doing law a different way or other kinds of options that they might pursue.
Is there anything else that you would like to say? This is your oral history, it's not mine. And so is there anything else that you would like to say, or any closing comments that you have?
Wow. Well, my particular journey was not a journey built on my desire to practice law. It was built on my desire to learn about how the law works so that I could have an impact on what was happening to women and be more than just a person on the outside who couldn't have a real effect. And it was also to protect myself from my brother and brother-in-law when my father died. I wanted to be able to know more than they did about my dad's business. And I needed the tools to do that. So practicing law was kind of incidental to me. What's really important to me here at the end, at this end of my life, is seeing women out there actively pursuing careers or political office, doing something that really makes a difference to them and that's going to improve their lives and the lives of other women.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it on behalf of the Senior Lawyers Division. And I thank all lawyers that you are willing to come here and share your experience and your knowledge and your perspectives with us. So I thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
All right.